This is Harold Sherman, founder of the ESP Research Associates Foundation of Little Rock, Arkansas. What you're about to hear is a remarkable tape recording prepared by Raymond Cass of London, England, one of the world's great research authorities on electronic voice phenomena. It contains invaluable information for all who wish to develop the ability to tape record spirit voices and to produce proof of life after death.
I should say perhaps at the outset that I share your concern in the States about Jurgenson, because Jurgenson doesn't answer letters. He not only doesn't answer letters from the average inquirer, but he hasn't replied to correspondence from leading members of the Psychical Research Society over here, from myself, Sheargold, or any of the others concerned in the EVP. We know that he has some kind of an arrangement or a contract with Philips for the release of 1 or 2 LP phonograph records with his voices. After his interview with a psychic researcher with Peter Bander last year in the summer of '75, everybody expected that the long-playing records would be released within a month or two, but there's absolutely no news on this in this regard. In fact, Philips themselves refused to enter into correspondence regarding the projected dialogue voice records. So we're just as much in the dark about Jurgenson as you are. And we're looking forward, of course, to hearing these voices, because as Peter Bander and the staff at Gerrard's Cross, England, confirmed, they do contain 5, 10, even up to 20-minute dialogue with the voice people. And this is a revolutionary development which Jurgenson has been working on for some years now, working very hard with a number of setbacks, the usual negative periods, such as I've had myself. I had one negative period lasting 2 years, from February 1974 to February 76, when conditions quite out of my control prevented any kind of voice recording at all, not even a microphone, except on 1 or 2 very isolated instances. Around the time you would send this cassette off to me here in Bridlington, I would be sending Harold Sherman the first copies he's heard of my own dialogue voices, which started to come through this year. But unlike Jurgenson's, which can last up to 10 or 20 minutes, mine are very rapid responses, but they're quite audible responses to my questions by the voice people. They very rarely run to more than 5 or 6 words, sometimes 10, and on the tape I've sent to Harold, no doubt he'll send you a copy. You'll find some of these dialogue responses, and these are quite audible responses relevant to the questions I put. They're a revolutionary breakthrough in their own way, but they're still short, machine gun-like break-ins. And in answer to your other query about my voices, the voices on the tape, on the cassette you've already heard, yes, they are received in such an abrupt and shortened manner. This is the way they come in. There's been no editing at all on those voices. I don't get long conversations, and the energy available to the voice people appears to be very limited. Approximately 10 words seems to be the maximum, although they do come through in bundles of perhaps 3 or 4 voices on a favorable day. And I'd like to stress that conditions have to be favorable, and in many instances, and at the moment particularly, I'm going through a negative phase which has lasted for 3 weeks. In many instances, atmospheric, meteorological, weather, phases of the moon, all these other kind of conditions appear to affect the possibility of contact, and the slightest thing which is not in order cuts us off. So these negative phases, these negative periods, are coming up all the time. And at the best, when conditions are good, when I'm in a patient and quiet-minded mood for experimenting, and when I'm concentrating on the matter at hand, which is very rare because in our particular business we're pretty well harassed from morning till night, and we can be doing domiciliary or night calls till 10 o'clock at night. Everybody with a hearing aid that goes wrong is screaming for attention. So the voice experimentation has to be done, unfortunately, in between. Some days it gets neglected, some weeks it gets neglected. So we're unable to keep to a very tight schedule, and the voice people, assuming they exist, they must get rather fed up at times because we're erratic. However, conditions at large are erratic. I'm situated in downtown Hull. That's a city of about 350,000 people in East Yorkshire, England, on the coast, and my office is downtown, surrounded by office buildings and stores, and in this particular room, in one particular corner, I get the transmissions on approximately 128 to 134 megahertz. It's moved up a little in the last 3 or 4 years, from 127 megahertz to approximately 132 megahertz. So let me repeat again, the voices you hear on my tapes, and some of them appear to be chopped off rather abruptly, that's the way they break in onto an ordinary band. In my case, it's the aircraft band, very occasionally on the AM band. I have one particular frequency where I'm starting to get them on the AM band, and that is on 1568 kilohertz. Now, Jurgenson's frequency has been quoted as 1450 kilohertz, but recently this has been corrected, and it's now said that he works on 1480 kilohertz on the AM band. That is between stations, and he has a beamed carrier wave which emits a tone, and when this tone is present, Jurgenson knows he's going to receive voices. Now, other people in Germany, in Europe, have been trying to obtain the EVP on what is known as the Jurgenson Welle. The Jurgenson Welle is German for the Jurgenson frequency, and one or two have been successful, but a great number of people have been unsuccessful. The people who have been successful, in my view, are in telepathic contact with Jurgenson and his voice people. And his voice people will cooperate in certain cases, and they'll duplicate the original Jurgenson phenomena on the tapes of other people. But they don't pick everybody. The reasons why they pick and choose one fellow against another, well, that we don't know yet. Now, I've recently been informed that other people in Germany are having some success between 9.8 megahertz and 9.9 megahertz, and that is the short wave band. I think it's somewhere around the 31 meter band. So they are hanging and sticking around that region, hoping to get voices. And you may be sure that if a fella gets a paranormal voice, a break-in, and I call mine break-ins because they do break in abruptly on top of whatever else is happening on the band. In Hull, of course, the air band isn't very active because we haven't got an airport within quite a few miles of here, so the normal inhabitants of this frequency are infrequent. They don't occur very often, and the band is largely empty, and the voice people appear to use the energy floating around on this band to break in. But I do stress they break in very abruptly, and they depart and recede equally abruptly, and that's what gives the abrupt effect on my tapes. And a lot of people have asked, why are they chopped off so cleanly and so abruptly? Well, that is the way they come in. Now, this is the sort of thing Jurgenson got for many years, but over the years, despite various setbacks, disappointments, depression, and sometimes feelings, I think, of bitterness, because he's found it hard to get any kind of recognition from orthodox science. This is the sort of thing Jurgenson got in his early days. Since then, and more recently, we believe, we've every reason to believe, and we're reliably informed that Jurgenson has indeed established a comparatively lengthy contact with his people, up to 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour, even up to 20 minutes. And this, of course, is a revolutionary thing. And this is the kind of material which Philips, the recording company in Eindhoven in Holland, they're an international company, as you know. Sometimes in the States they're known as Norelco Limited. The Philips label are due to publish Jurgenson's voices, but we don't know when. Now we're beginning to get a little bit worried because we haven't heard anything from Jurgenson recently. We wonder if he has given or sold the rights for his voice examples to Philips and received for them a sum of money, but at the same time may be tied up with Philips as to copyright and rights of reproduction, so that it's now up to Philips to decide when or even if to release this valuable and revolutionary material. Philips are an old established, as you know, conservative company, and they may have had second thoughts about releasing a revolutionary long-playing phonograph record concerning audible contact with the dead, with voices claiming to be those of the dead. On the other hand, they may be researching this even further, probing Jurgenson, trying to establish the genuineness of this phenomenon before they venture onto the world market with this record. So this is all speculation. Mr. Loriot, we just don't know, and we're unable to get any reaction from Philips, and again on this matter they do not respond to correspondence. What we do know, however, is that earlier this year Jurgenson visited Germany, made one or two contacts with the German EVP Union, and told one of their members that out of the proceeds, out of the money from the sale, the international sale of his records, and out of the proceeds coming out of the sale of his estate or his country house in Sweden, he hoped to establish in Switzerland or somewhere nearabouts a research institute for the EVP. Now that was approximately in February 1976, and since then there's been silence. If Philips now own the copyright for these voices, then of course it's up to them whether they publish them in 6 months' time or in 6 years' time or never. So we don't know what kind of arrangements Jurgenson has made. We know last year on his visit to England that he was rather aggressive, highly emotional. Probably he resented the attention Raudive, the limelight Raudive had obtained in the English-speaking world. Jurgenson, unfortunately, because his major book has never been translated into the English, has been badly neglected on our side, on both sides of the Atlantic, amongst the English-speaking peoples. And one of his main causes for complaint is that there's terrible confusion about the EVP as per Jurgenson and the EVP as per Raudive, Sheargold, Bill Welsh and others. And I've got to go into that a little bit for you to explain what I mean. Well, you know that my voices, although they're fragmentary and rather short and cut off, they're quite loud, they're quite vocal. They have a little bit of background noise, white sound and interference, but mostly you can pick out pretty quickly what they're saying. They're vocal, and loud, and Jurgenson's are even more vocal and louder still and more sustained. Now, this is a transmission from a voice source, and this isn't a ghost drifting in through a window, looking over your shoulder and deciding to speak to you on your tape recorder. This is a controlled, technically initiated transmission from a voice source using some kind of technology, and when it breaks in onto your recorder, you hear an audible click or you hear a very loud tone. Sometimes the volume of these break-ins can be deafening. Jurgenson gave many instances of this in the early pages of his book, and I've had these extremely loud and sudden interventions on my tapes. And some of them are almost too good to be true. This controlled transmitting or emitting source is highly selective. When they get a fix on an experimenter, and they have a fix on a number of people in all hemispheres, and we believe even in the Eastern Bloc, in the Soviet Union, they beam down, they transmit down to a highly selective and restricted area around the experimenter and his immediate environment, and this can be confined to, this beaming down can be confined to one particular tape recorder. In other words, another setup, another radio and recorder, even in the same room, a few yards away, or in the next room, or in the apartment next door, tuned to the same frequency, set up within the same careful limits, will not receive the voices. So the voices are highly selective. It's been reliably reported that last year Jurgenson visited a well-known Swedish voice experimenter who happens to use the same portable recorder, a Ua Austrian recorder, as himself, and he took his radio along to the woman in question, to the experimenter in question, and they sat down in her apartment and conducted an experiment, and they hooked up his radio with a twin Y-cord to both tape recorders, and they waited for the voices to come in, and they were presumably tuned to Jurgenson's frequency, which is 1480 kilohertz on the medium wave band. Cut a long story short, what happened was the voices broke in onto Jurgenson's recording machine, and the unfortunate woman sat next to him, working on the same test bench, tuned and connected to the same radio, got a blank on her recorder. So what I'm talking about, Mr. Loriot, is high selectivity, a laser pencil-like beam working in a very small area and excluding other people. Of course, as you'll realize, if these transmissions are loud and very audible, then it wouldn't do to be receiving them in your apartment and somebody innocently tuning in the next apartment around the shortwave or the medium wave band and picking up paranormal voices. He could complain to the broadcasting authorities and he could kick up a stink. So the voice people, the experimental source putting out these transmissions, confines it, and it's very cautious and it's camouflaged. It confines these transmissions to the immediate area of the experimenter, and this can be within a matter of inches or feet. Now, in my whole location, I have one particular corner in my office where at the moment I'm set up for the voices on the aircraft band. Now, if I move that setup to the other side of the office, or even to my office above and on the next floor, then it appears that the voice people require a few days or even a few weeks to readjust their beaming, so that if I upset the parameters or the conditions of the experiment, my results suffer. The results are affected by atmospheric and other conditions. They were affected very badly when construction work was going on around my office, tearing down old buildings and putting up new buildings, department stores. There's a mass X-ray center nearby, interference from various sources. But we're coming now to the point about interference, because many other people with aircraft band receivers have tried the aircraft band and they haven't been successful. Now, I have a number of radios, mostly Japanese or Hong Kong, which have aircraft band capability. But I have one particular set, a Juliet, that was marketed years ago by the Topps Corporation of Miami in Florida. A Juliet multi-band receiver costing originally about £30 sterling in 1968. These sets were widely sold, quite a handy portable multi-wave set with AM, FM, marine band, VHF, which includes the aircraft band and the public service band. Now, on this particular radio, I get the break-ins on top of the aircraft band, and this one radio is sensitive also to car ignition interference and interference from any machinery, drills, or any machinery, electrical apparatus or instruments being used in and around my office. For instance, my own drill for polishing ear molds regarding hearing aids is picked up by the antenna of this receiver when it's tuned to the aircraft band, and you hear this high-pitched whine. Now, many receivers of cheaper or even better quality will shield or filter this interference out, and a good receiver, of course, should filter out at the front end as much interference as possible. Now, this particular Juliet of mine appears to have a slight fault. It allows certain frequencies to break through, that is to say, car ignition interference. Interference from the operation of electric drills or motors in the area. Sometimes interference from faulty fluorescent lighting. You may have heard the voice concerning that on my tape. Harold Sherman has it. So this fault is a useful fault. If I have a radio engineer to correct this fault on this set and to filter out all interference, I'm perfectly sure, as you know yourself, that I'll be filtering out the voices themselves. The voices use these frequencies. It sometimes seems to me that when there's a burst of car ignition interference from the car parks around my office in the rush hours when there's a lot of traffic moving, that the voices use these stray and spare and superfluous frequencies. You mention the appearance and the receding of a voice when a car is passing your apartment. Now, I've had this too, but I get it when the recorder is linked up to this particular radio by cord, by line cord, and the radio is sensitive to everything that's going on in the area. Some days are quiet and some days are noisy. Some days have a lot of interference and breakthrough, and on other days, according to the atmospheric and the magnetic conditions, what have you, in the area, are affecting ordinary radio transmissions. Some days are good and bad for voices and good and bad for interference. So if there's a reasonable background of interference, I seem to get voices. If it's too quiet, then the voices recede as well. On all my recordings, although some of the voices are quite loud, you'll discern a fair amount of background crackle, and occasionally you'll get the car ignition interference. And all this is high-frequency interference. It's picked up by this set. Now, I spent a lot of money on a more advanced Juliet sometime afterwards, imagining and hoping that by laying out some money I'd get even more voices. But what I got actually was a superior radio with effective filtering and effective noise control, and this filtered out the voices as well. Although there were faint voices in the background, I had to quickly revert to my original Juliet, the cheaper model, which has this kind of inbuilt fault. So you might say Mr. Loriot, that my particular success in receiving paranormal voices is partly due to a fluky radio. And you could also say that if a burglar breaks in tomorrow night and steals, takes away, rips me off for this particular radio, then I shall have a struggle to get the voices again. I'm highly dependent on this Juliet. Therefore, I really ought to insure it for a few £1,000s, because this is the one which gets the voices, but it gets the voices when conditions are right, and conditions are not always right. It gets the voices, apparently, when I can concentrate, when I can cut off other things out of my mind and sit quietly by, talking to them and encouraging them to come through. But if I'm at all harassed, have half a dozen other things on my mind, then it seems that they're prevented from getting through. So the whole thing hangs by a tenuous thread. The important thing to remember is that my voices, loud, abrupt, like machine gun fire, are in the same category and class as the Jurgenson voices. They're produced by the same emitting or transmitting source, a powerful source which can, if it wishes, break in at a very high volume level. And occasionally, as Jurgenson said in his book, he was shaken out of his pants when these very loud and forceful transmissions broke through. But these people are very sparing. They have a high degree of security. They have their own censorship rules, because, after all, we must realize that any abrupt or sudden interference on the broadcast frequencies on this planet would bring about swift response from the authorities concerned. You can take it from me, and this was stated in a BBC broadcast not so long ago, that any interference by radio pirates on the VHF band, on the aircraft bands, is detected very rapidly and traced to its source, and within a matter of minutes it's suppressed and stifled. And I've often wondered, of course, whether the pilots flying aircraft over my location are aware of the voices breaking in onto the aircraft band. And I personally don't think they are, because although I've used this band for a number of years, including, of course, the long negative period from 74 to 76, there have been no complaints from any authorities of the intrusion of abnormal voices on the band. Therefore, I assume that what I've been receiving has been confined to me, and anybody next door tuned to 127 or 128 megahertz in the apartment next door would not receive what I've been receiving. They're beamed to me personally as they're beamed to Jurgenson. If there is a transference, if another person is taken into this organization, another experimenter is selected, then he will very quickly be aware of the fact that on certain occasions unexpected and loud voices, sometimes musical break-ins, occur on his receiver. Now these, Mr. Loriot, are quite different from the white noise whisper voices you are mostly talking about, and the white noise whisper type voices received by Sheer Gold and people over here following the Raudiver method and technique as described in Raudiver's books. So we're talking about two entirely different classes of EVP. One, a loud and controlled emission or transmission from an unknown source, and the other, the reception of faint, difficult to hear whisper voices embedded in white sound. And for this, of course, you need a trained ear, as you say. You don't need a trained ear necessarily for the transmissions initiated by what Jurgenson has entitled the Central Investigation Organization. This is a kind of CIA on the other side, which takes care of the breakthrough onto our wavebands and ensures that the intrusions are gradual and meted out in doses which we can absorb here on Earth, and which won't attract too much attention in the early stages from the authorities. So to summarize on this particular point, Jurgenson is in contact with a highly organized technological source from the other side. People who are working in a highly organized manner, tightly knit, and who are contacting certain individuals. We don't know what is the basis, what are the criteria for the selection of those individuals. This is one of the things which is a mystery at the moment. Other people receiving fainter voices or receiving voices embedded in white sound and straining to hear them are possibly in touch with individual voice sources on the other side, or less highly organized groups. Jurgenson is in contact with a highly organized group, and I've reason to believe that the Jurgenson group of people on the other side, organizing this thing and introducing it very, very gradually onto our earthly scene, contacted me at an early stage of my work, provided me with the necessary evidence, strong evidence of their presence and their contact, and provided me with the necessary motivation to carry on my particular brand of work within the EVP, which has led eventually to louder voices than average, and has now led to meaningful dialogue. Unfortunately, I haven't achieved the long and sustained dialogue obtained by Jurgenson, and I haven't any information on any other experimenters who are in touch with their particular communicators for more than a few words or an odd sentence at a time. From all this you'll gather, and this answers one of your queries: how do I do it, and what information can I give you, so that you can do it too? The answer is that I really don't know. I have a receiver which appears to be highly sensitive to the reception of EVP because of an internal fault which allows frequencies to break through which should be normally filtered out. I don't know whether any other examples of this particular model, 1968 model, have this same fault. I call it a fault because on other receivers in my possession and on my later model Juliet, the break-in is much more restricted and subdued. They've filtered it out. And of course, in any hi-fi equipment, front-end breakthrough is an undesirable factor. It's the hope and the aim of every hi-fi constructor, every manufacturer, to rid his apparatus, to rid his system of unwanted interference from local radio stations, from electrical gear in the same building, and so on and so on. But the EVP, the voice people, appear to require some kind of frequency upon which they can ride. Some people have said ride parasitically. In other words, they're hitching a ride on frequencies broadcast by terrestrial transmitters, or on a combination of carrier waves and frequencies in the vicinity of terrestrial transmitting stations. Now, I'm interested to hear that your voice transmissions, your voice source, has transferred its phenomenon to a telepathic contact with your mind, thus bypassing the tape recorder. Now, this is a very good thing, probably a desirable thing, but I can understand that you can't objectively demonstrate this to someone else, and it's still necessary for you to get something on tape. Otherwise, it's a subjective phenomenon and not an objective phenomenon. Now, this is paralleled in Jurgenson's early work. In approximately 1964, Jurgen went through a period of depression when he was not getting the necessary recognition or cooperation from anybody, when he was working entirely in an isolated fashion on his own with very little support. He at one point became rather depressed and disgusted with the whole thing. He packed his tape recorders and his apparatus away where he couldn't see them, and he attempted to carry on a normal life. He was an artist and a writer and a producer, a producer of documentary programs at the time. He tried to carry on and push the EVP out of his life. Suddenly, in the sound of rainfall, in ambient sounds in a room, in the rush of a passing car, or the whine or the roar of an aircraft passing overhead, the voices would begin to break through in his head to his auditory apparatus. And so, when this became very persistent, he dug out again his tape recorder and his gear, and the voices reverted to appearing on tape, and they disappeared from his head. They were very determined, obviously, to get through, and they were very determined that his depression, that his period of negative thinking on the EVP should be corrected and should be brought to a conclusion, because they wanted to get ahead with certain important experiments and work. And so his experience parallels your experience. You're in contact with certain forces telepathically. This I can quite accept. I can see how it works. I agree with you that they can read your thoughts. I've had absolute evidence, proof on my tapes that they're capable of reading my thoughts, of looking ahead, seeing my intentions. They've even predicted recently an upsurge in business. We went through, approximately 10 weeks ago, a very bad period of business. We started to get worried. I don't know what the cause of this was, the economic situation. We felt that the ground was beginning to shift underneath us and that the cash flow was coming to a halt. I got a very clear voice, half English and half German, and this voice, translated, said, this was a female voice, was on the aircraft band, and it predicted exactly an upsurge, an increase in cash takings via the business, and we couldn't see this at the time, and yet within 3 days of receiving this particular voice, we had an influx of business which has gone on, and I'm speaking now on the 6th of October, and this was 10 or 12 weeks ago, and the business has been sustained, and the prediction of the voice has been justified and fully borne out. And this is only one instance of a prediction which has come true. I have many other instances where they've been able to read my thoughts, look into my motivations, and even to give me advice or to contradict me if my intentions were contrary to their wishes. For instance, on one occasion I didn't see why my experiment should be confined to one location, and I discussed very seriously with my colleague Miss Feuchter the desirability of recording experiments at home on the coast at Bridlington and not in my office at Hull. The very next day a strong and irritable voice was received: you can't have two places. So these people are of a very definite and positive frame of mind with regard to these experiments, and so our particular part in them, our control over what happens and what is received, isn't very pronounced. We're in their hands, and this is one of the reasons again why I can't tell you how to get these results, because very largely I'm in their hands. I receive what is put through to me. If there's a negative period, or if they're not transmitting to my particular reception point, then there's nothing to be received, and I haven't the faintest or slightest control over these proceedings. Very recently, another British experimenter working on my lines, receiving Jurgenson-type voices, has arisen in Great Britain, and his name is Mike Vinter, and he's receiving loud, clear, polyglot and musical voices similar to mine, and he's been in correspondence with me. He's had my name on the band, on tape. He uses a diode, a simple diode, but he gets quite loud voices, abrupt break-ins, using various languages and sometimes polyglot language structure. And it seems to me that in this particular case, my group, the group working through me, and I've reason to believe that this group is linked to groups from the other side concerned with Jurgenson and Raudive, that my results have rubbed off onto Mike Winter, and there may be here an instance of telepathic influence or telepathic contact. Now, I can't tell you, Mr. Loriot, if this group of entities will suddenly invade the privacy of your experiments and burst in onto your frequencies. This is something that is out of my control. I can't predict if it's going to happen. It could happen. It has happened, but they're very sparing and they're very selective, and we don't know how or why they decide when to commence with a certain experimenter. There are reports coming out of the Soviet Union and out of the Eastern Bloc of voice experimenters working in those countries, but we don't know, unfortunately, how far this contact has progressed. We do know from European sources that one female voice experimenter in Moscow has been threatened with the loss of her academic job unless she gives up this business of tape recording paranormal voices. So governments, especially totalitarian governments, I don't think look very favorably on a thing like the EVP. And I also think that if in the next 25 years some technical group evolves an instrument which will enable us to solve these problems of receiving the loud paranormal voices, then governments may not look too favorably upon everybody retiring to their attic or to their garden woodshed and listening to the voices of the dead. Governments and security agencies are not very much in favor of transmissions of any kind of voices or emissions or transmissions over which they have no control and where they don't know the exact source and its location. And so if an instrument is evolved, if this EVP becomes more widespread, then I think we can be pretty sure that in some countries it will be banned, it will be restricted and licensed. And we've got that to face in the future if we ever get that far. So to sum up again, we're talking about, on the one hand, faint whisper-type voices where the ear needs some special training to pick them out from white noise background, voices put out probably by individuals on the other side of low power and low amplitude, and on the other hand, highly organized emissions, transmissions and signals put out by a central intelligence organization, as Jurgenson persists in calling it. And this organization puts out powerful beams, powerful emissions, beams onto individual experimenters, is highly mysterious and camouflaged in its operations, can bring about, if it wishes, direct intervention onto ordinary broadcasts, and I've had instances of these which I haven't published, and can also probably interfere with ordinary broadcast transmissions, if necessary, cause interruptions in programs, and eventually, of course, intervention on certain programs put out by our transmitters on this earth. And this will be a point of intervention from the unseen source into the affairs of this earth. And we don't know when this will take place or if it will be allowed to take place, because of the possible reaction it would evoke. So there you have the two distinct forms of EVP, and the reason you haven't heard a great deal about the Jurgenson type of transmissions, which are loud and clear, even if they're rather short and staccato, machine gun-like, is that Jurgenson's work has never been adequately translated, and details of his work have never been presented even in articles in Fate magazine and similar outlets. So what we're up against is the absence of a translation of Jurgenson's book, which in the early days, and when I first read it, opened up an entirely new chapter for me into the EVP. So in Europe and in Germany, where most everybody has read this book, you find experimental work operating on an entirely different level. In the English-speaking world, we have people listening to white noise, training their ears to pick out voices against the background, utilizing the microphone method,